it's really nice to come back and share some stuff about grasshoppers with everyone. So I guess so yeah, I'm just gonna kind of go through. Here's grasshoppers of Maine, from the everyday to the extraordinary, and here's just a few examples of some species. These are all species you can find in Maine, and probably some of the more spectacular ones. And all these photos throughout the whole presentation are mine, mostly taken in Maine or New Hampshire, and a couple have snuck in from other places. Okay, how do I progress the slides here? Okay. All right. So first off, what is a grasshopper? Most of you probably know a grasshopper when you see one, but sometimes you might want to know how to distinguish from crickets or katydids. So grasshoppers are members of the order Orthoptera and suborder Silifera. The other suborder is Ensiphera, which is all the crickets and katydids. And basically, when you see one of these, insects with the big jumping hind legs, the most obvious thing to look for is antennae length. So grasshoppers pretty much all have short antennae. So you can see, you can see my pointer here, but yeah, basically all these, this is a little bit cut off, but grasshoppers pretty much always have short antennae that are, no longer than the length of the head and pronotum. And then crickets and katydids, on the other hand, always have these super long, really thread-like antennae, like down here and over here, that are all, pretty hard to miss. And the other thing to look at when you have a female is the ovipositor. So in grasshoppers, ovipositor has is kind of composed of these short little valves here. You can see this is an ovipositor of Dysostera, where there's basically 4 valves, kind of 2 on top and 2 on the bottom, and they kind of are very short and kind of slightly curved and pointed at the apices. And in crickets and katydids, if you have a female of those, the ovipositor is a lot more obvious. You can see here. Can you all see my pointer?
Yes, we got it.
Okay, cool. So yeah, in crickets and katydids, you can see the females of those have really long ovipositors, these big long sword-shaped things, or these big long pointy things, and so grasshoppers never have those. But of course, that doesn't help you with males. And then the other thing to look at is the tympanum, which is the ear. And you can see in grasshoppers, they have the tympanum on the first abdominal segment that you can kind of see by kind of lifting up the wings on these guys. You can see this little thing here is the tympanum. And then in crickets and katydids, it's on the foreleg. So here's the foreleg of this katydid here, and you can see this little slit in the foretibia, and that's where their ears are. So yeah, basically that's kind of how you tell grasshoppers from crickets and katydids. And I will not cover crickets and katydids today, but maybe in the future. Yeah, I'll progress here. Okay, that's just that. I'm gonna stop using this. So in terms of identification, this is kind of what most of my talk is going to kind of go over, more basic, identification, natural history stuff. One thing you might want to know is telling a male from a female. And it's sometimes it can be kind of difficult, I have to say. Sometimes when I'm looking at photos, I'm like, is that a male? Is that a female? If the photo is kind of, you can't see the end of the abdomen, sometimes it's hard. But with enough practice, it kind of becomes fairly simple. You can kind of see here's a male and female of Cortophagia. And the one thing to note if you have both sexes is that females are pretty much always bigger than the males, which is kind of a general thing in a lot of insect groups. Females are bigger, they have the eggs. And but that doesn't help you if you only have one. The other thing to look at is, again, that ovipositor. If you had a cricket or a katydid, it's really obvious. They have that big, long, sword-shaped thing. But in these guys, you can see on the female here, there's these kind of, again, these short little curved valves of the ovipositor. And the male, you can see these 2 things sticking out are just a cerci, but then the tip of the abdomen just kind of comes to a more like rounded, blunt tip, and there isn't these like really hard, sharp, curved valves there. So you kind of, if you look at enough grasshopper butts, you can kind of figure this out, and it becomes fairly obvious. And then another thing you might want to look at is figuring out whether you have a nymph or an adult. And this is actually kind of important because a lot of the short-winged species historically were kind of ignored because nymphs are often really hard to identify. And a lot of historical collectors would kind of ignore nymphs or just kind of, they collect them and then just throw them out because they'd be like, this is a nymph, you can't identify it, it's going to shrivel, it's not going to preserve well, whatever. And therefore, a lot of the short-winged species kind of got overlooked. But looking at these two pictures, you might think, oh, they're both nymphs, little short wings. But in fact, this one on the left here is an adult female of a short-winged species, and over here on the right is a nymph of a long-winged species. And so how do you tell these apart? It's really subtle, but I picked these pictures specifically because it kind of illustrates a point here. So in a nymph of a long-winged or short-winged species, the hind wings will be on the outside. So you can see here, these two big wing buds on the outside are actually the hind wings. And then these in the middle here are the forewings. And then when that becomes an adult, the forewings will kind of bend outward and then cover the hind wings. And then in a short-winged adult, the forewings are on top. And so these two things are the forewings. And if you were to kind of lift those up, there you would see like a very, very short hind wing that is, almost not noticeable. And so this is again kind of difficult to notice, but if you kind of look at enough images like this, and if you see them in the field, it kind of will become a little more clear, and you kind of look for whether the wings on top are the forewings or the hind wings. Okay, so basic grasshopper biology in Maine, kind of similar to how they are in a lot of the Northeast or temperate areas. All of our species are univoltine. They are all one generation a year, mostly egg overwintering, in that most of our species overwinter as eggs, hatch out as little baby nymphs in spring, April, May, go through maybe 5 to 6 nymphal instars, leaving these nice little shed skins along the way, shed exoskeletons, and then maturing sometime in mid to late summer, July to August, and they often need to hang off of something to molt, as illustrated here, whether it's a rock surface or a branch or smooth grass or the side of a house, and they often kind of need to molt going downward to kind of help gravity help them along. And so yeah, most of these species mature in the summer, and then they kind of mate and lay eggs throughout the late summer and fall, and then they're kind of killed off by cold weather, frost in the fall. And but of course, there's a few exceptions to this. There's 3 species in our area that overwinter as nymphs, which is actually kind of interesting in that these nymphs are overwintering just kind of hunkered down under the leaf litter. I don't really know how they do it. And then they kind of pop out really early in the spring as soon as it kind of gets warm, and then they mature really rapidly since they're already, in 4th, 5th instar, and then they're adults in April to May when all the other species are still eggs, are barely even hatching out. And so they kind of get a jump start on the fresh vegetation in the spring, and then they are kind of adults, mating, laying eggs throughout spring and early summer, kind of dying off mostly of old age in midsummer. And so yeah, you can see on the right here, they are mating. They're kind of always males mates on top of the female. And here's another example of a short-winged species. So yeah, if you see 2 grasshoppers with little wings and they're mating, they are not nymphs, because nymphs would not be doing that. And then in terms of egg laying, we see actually all of our species here lay eggs in soil. And so here's a female cortophagia ovipositing. You can see her ovipositor kind of going down into the soil there. And if you were to pull her out right there, the membranes between the abdominal tergites become really, really extended when they lay eggs, because they stick the egg pods really deep. So if you were to pull her out, the abdomen would be like twice its length, which is twice its normal length, which is kind of grotesque to see. And then so they have to grow up. They're feeding. Basically all of our species are kind of generalist feeders, feed on lots of different grasses, forbs, short plants. But once again, a couple of exceptions. There are some species of grasshoppers that are actually super duper host specific, and such as one really extreme example is the Florida rosemary grasshopper, Circus radiola, which of course is a Florida endemic, not found around here. But this is a species that is very host specific on one species of plant, the Florida rosemary. And this species, I have seen this thing in the wild, and it's a really cool animal. And they will not leave the rosemary bushes. Like if you come up to them, they'll just kind of hide in the bush, and if you poke them, they'll jump to another one of these bushes. Is really interesting. They're super duper host specific, and there have been studies showing that even when starved, they will not eat anything else. So in that sense, some of these species of grasshoppers can be like some of the more famous species, like monarchs only eat milkweed, other species of insects that are host specific. But in our area, there are mostly they're generalists, but there's a couple of kind of more slightly more host specific species. Like for instance, a lot of the gomphosarines here are basically feed on grasses and sedges, and they won't eat anything broadleafed. And then some of the melanoplines will only eat broadleafed things, and they won't touch a piece of grass, which is funny given that they're grasshoppers. They won't eat grass. And then there's one or two species, I guess, like Melanopus fasciatus in our area, which I'll get to later, is kind of a specialist on, I think, a genus, Vaccinium, which is the blueberries and huckleberries, kind of these low ericaceous shrubs. So some of these species, you can if you know what they eat, you can kind of target finding them that way. So, and then of course, as they're growing up, they're getting constantly attacked and killed by a whole host of predators and parasites. Obviously, pretty much any generalist predatory creature will, not pass up the opportunity to eat a grasshopper. All sorts of birds, all sorts of frogs, spiders, praying mantids, assassin bugs, anything like that. Any predatory thing you can name will not pass up a grasshopper meal. And then there are some more specific ones as well. Fungi, for example, down here in the bottom left is an example of a grasshopper that's been killed by an entomopathogenic fungus, which infects the grasshopper and causes it to kind of climb up to an exposed perch. In this case, it was up on a high pine branch, and then the grasshopper kind of dies there, grasps the pine branch really firmly, and then the fungal spores all disperse from that and then kind of shower down to hopefully infect other grasshoppers below. So sometimes you'll see this where it's like a grasshopper that's kind of looks all desiccated and dried out and bleached, and it's kind of like just tightly grasping some high perch, and it's like, you did not die of old age, you died because a fungus caused you to go up there. So sometimes you see this, and it's actually really cool. And then there are also flies in our area that are pretty major parasitoids of grasshoppers. I've had many a time where I collect a grasshopper, and then the next day there are these, big white maggots kind of wiggling around in the container. And it's kind of interesting. You can rear these up, they will pupate and they will turn into these little flies like this that are usually either tachinids or sarcophagids, two major families that kind of go after grasshoppers. And these are probably pretty major in regulating their populations of these species. So yeah, they're pretty interesting. They do a lot of interesting things, and there's a number of things to kind of look at when you're trying to ID things and when you're trying to arrive at an ID for a grasshopper in Maine or anywhere. And some of the more important things are in morphology, looking at the pronotum shape and looking at the hind wing pattern. You might remember, or you might notice that a lot of grasshoppers will fly away from you with, brightly colored black or yellow wings. Look at those patterns sometimes. The male Circe terminalia, of course, this is kind of a tried and true thing in entomology where so many things you have to dissect the genitalia for. And luckily in Maine, most of our grasshoppers you don't really have to dissect so much. A lot of our species, you can pretty much just ID from sight alone, or or some of the more tricky ones, if you can just get a kind of good look in hand with a little hand lens or even the naked eye at the, kind of butt end of them. They're pretty easy to ID. So you don't have to bother dissecting our species. When you gets into the tropics, it gets a little more confusing. And then some other things in terms of like behavior and biology to look at, especially when you're seeing them in the field. Seasonality, like I said, if you're finding, an adult grasshopper in May in Maine, there's really only a couple of options to choose from, things like that. And then habitat is also honestly really key for identifying a lot of the grasshoppers here. We have a small suite of species that are really generalist that you can find in pretty much any open area, vacant lots, roadsides, old fields, whatever. But most of our species are actually pretty habitat specific, that you'll only find them in like open scrublands or in the coastal grasslands or in sand dunes or open rocks on the top of the mountain or sedge bogs, sphagnum bogs. So a lot of these things are really, really habitat specific. And so you really won't see them unless you are going out in these habitats and looking for bugs. And then behavior too. Obviously, most of our species are they just jump away from you, typical grasshopper behavior. And a lot of species will fly away as adults. But some species will fly really, really far. Some species will fly all the way down the path. Some species will fly 2 feet. And then in terms of defensive behavior as well, a lot of species, if you pick them up, I'm sure most of you have probably picked up a grasshopper and had it vomit up on you, that kind of brown stuff that they call tobacco juice, which obviously is not tobacco juice. It's just kind of their vomit, which is usually filled with some sort of unpleasant secretions that if you ate it, you'd probably be spitting it up. But it's supposed to be a defensive mechanism, but it's kind of interesting to see. And some species vomit up a lot more than others. And some species, when you're walking by, they will, instead of trying to fly or jump away, they'll be perched on a piece of grass like this, and then they'll just kind of sidle around to the other side so you don't see them. So there's all sorts of little behavioral quirks like that we kind of look at. And then basically, so the rest of this talk, I'm kind of going to just kind of go through all these species and kind of give an overview of each one, kind of give you a few pointers on identifying them and how to find them if you want to see these things. And yeah, so there's give or take, there's about 36 grasshopper species in the state of Maine. This is, this list could probably be expanded a little bit. This list here is basically all the species that I know for sure occur in Maine right now. And there are 1 or 2 species that I didn't include here that are historically known from here, but I have really tried to find them over many years and never seen them, and I've never seen any recent records. So I'm pretty skeptical that they occur here. And there are some other species, of course, that are recorded from nearby Massachusetts or Ontario or Quebec that could occur here. I haven't seen any recent records of them, and I haven't seen them, but they could be here, or they might be here soon. So yeah, this list could probably be expanded, but not by a whole lot. And so the grasshoppers in our area are divided up into basically 3 families, 2 of which, the tetragids, pygmy grasshoppers, and tridactylids, pygmy mole crickets, which are actually grasshoppers, and I'll get to that later, are really small, not many species, and they're pretty much only associated with like open, wet, muddy areas. And so basically most of the grasshoppers that you have to worry about are Inocrididae, the shorthorn grasshoppers, and these are kind of split up into 3 major big subfamilies. Gomphoscerines, the slant-faced, are basically creatures of open grasslands, open areas with grasses and sedges, kind of tend to have a very slanted face, backwards slanting. And the Oedipodines are the band-winged grasshoppers. These are the ones that fly away from you with really bright black and yellow hind wings, and these are usually creatures of kind of open, barren ground, open rocks, open sand, open mud, things like that. And then the melanopolines, the spur-throated grasshoppers, which are named for this little prosternal process, which is a little spur that sticks out underneath the head that these other subfamilies don't have. And these species are, they're all over the place. They can kind of be in a lot of different habitats. So yeah, I'll just kind of go through these species here, kind of go through each one. So Chloealtis, and I would mention first before I got off that all of these photos are mine, mostly taken in Maine or New Hampshire. Most of them will have I've written in the locality where I've taken these photos. A lot of them, some of them you might recognize. Some of them are places we have had MES field days in the past. And yeah, like for instance, over here down at the bottom, this one I photographed at the Reclaimed Plains in Old Orchard Beach, Maine, which is a place we had a field day back in 2014, 2015 maybe, and which has sadly now been destroyed for housing development, which is really disappointing. But yeah, you'll probably recognize a number of the names of these places in here. So anyway, Chloealtis conspersa, sprinkled grasshopper. This is actually a really pretty species that people don't really see that often, even though it's really widespread in Maine. The males are really distinctive in that they have this the sides of the pronotum are like completely black. And so they basically just look like they have a little black square on their sides. And these and the females are not quite as striking, but they're usually found in the same areas and often mating. This is kind of a species of like open woodland edges and kind of areas with native grasses. They tend to prefer native bunch grasses, and they usually need places with some open grass, but also a lot of wood, because the females only lay their eggs in dead wood. And so sometimes you'll see these females with their ovipositor kind of inserted all the way into a hole in the wood. And I'm pretty sure they pretty much always use holes made by other insects like beetles or carpenter ants or whatever to lay into. But yeah, this is a species that needs both dead wood and grass, so they're pretty much always at the ecotone between woodland and grassland. So yeah, it's pretty widespread in the state and in most of the Northeast, but usually in very small numbers. Like I never really find more than a few at a time. And this is kind of an early, they do overwinter as eggs, but this is kind of an early maturing species, and they kind of become adults by late June, early July, and then you can kind of find them throughout the rest of the summer and trickling into the fall. Okay, Dichromorphoviridis, short-winged green grasshopper. This is a species that probably some of you have seen, but it's not too common in the state yet, but I think it will be probably increasing in the most of the rest of the eastern US and southern US. This is incredibly abundant. This thing is like a common species found in lawns and roadsides and ditches and old vacant lots, and really, really common in places where there's short grass. And up until recently, there weren't really that many records in the Northeast, but I think it is starting to be found more regularly in New Hampshire and in Maine. So I suspect this is a species that's kind of moving north with climate change and is pretty well adapted to do so, since it does well in lawns and kind of crappy habitats like that. So this is kind of an interesting example where the common name doesn't really mean a whole lot, because short-winged green grasshopper, sometimes they are short-winged and green, and sometimes they're long-winged and green, and sometimes they're have long wings and they're gray, and sometimes they're short-winged and gray. And so this is kind of one of these common names. It doesn't mean a whole lot, but the males are kind of always consistent like this. The males are generally always short-winged, and they kind of have a green back and then kind of green legs and then brown underneath. And then the females are actually way more variable. Females can be long or short-winged, females can be green or gray, and then various shades of gray or brown. And so yeah, these are kind of interesting species, and the females are actually quite a bit bigger than the males. So when you see them paired in the wild, it's kind of funny. The male is very, very small compared to the female. So yeah, this is a species I've seen in mostly southern Maine in kind of open lawns and fields, but I think it is increasing in the state, and probably might be found further north soon. And this is a grass feeder. This pretty much will only feed on grass, and this is basically a late summer species, overwintering as egg. Orphalella speciosa, slant-faced pasture grasshopper, is pretty common in the state, but again, not super abundant, but widespread and pretty common in a lot of different open grassy habitats. Again, a grass feeder, and these guys generally tend to prefer native grasses as opposed to non-native lawn grasses like Dichromorpha does. And so these guys tend to be found in more native grassland type habitats, but yeah, and this is very, very variable. This can be brown, this can be green, this can be long-winged or short-winged, but generally the wings are not super duper long. Usually the wings only get to about the tip of the abdomen, or maybe slightly beyond. And one thing to note with the males of these is that they have these really thickened fore and middle femora. So you can see these two images show males, and then over here is females. So you can see in the males, the middle femora here is really, really thickened compared to a lot of other grasshoppers. So this is kind of something to look for, which is kind of subtle, but it's something to look for. And then usually this species has this kind of distinctive shape and coloration on the pronotum, where it's kind of pinched in the middle. You can see here, and there's kind of these black and white triangles and shapes kind of on top here. You can see on the female as well. And this is kind of usually not found in a lot of other species. So yeah, kind of a variable species, certainly in overall color, but kind of distinctive once you have ruled out everything else. This is a species that I was confused by a lot when I was learning all these things. When I'd find these and I'd be like, what is this? And I'd rule out everything else, and I'd be like, oh, it's Orphalella. So kind of a difficult one. This one, Pseudocorthypus critipennis, marsh meadow grasshopper, is honestly probably one of our most common grasshoppers across the state. This thing is found in pretty much any open grassy area, and is found super duper late into the fall. I've found, well, for example, this one I found in Kennebunk, Maine, on Christmas Day, these things live really, really far into the fall. And this is usually pretty distinctive because it has these really very jet black knees or hind knees. And once again, it's kind of a very variable species. You can see on the right here, these are two females of this is the same species, and they can be green, they can be brown, any kind of combination of the two. The males are usually kind of distinctive. Males kind of have this kind of black and white striping on the abdomen and kind of long, kind of slightly thickened antennae and these big black eyes. But yeah, these species, this thing is really, really common. You know, if you've been out in any open field in Maine, you've probably seen this. And these guys actually stridulate and they make sound by rubbing these little pegs on the inside of the hind femur against a little row of pegs on the side of the wing. And not a lot of other grasshoppers make these kind of sounds like this. Crickets and katydids are mostly responsible for all the orthopteran noise you hear in late summer, and then some of the bandwing grasshoppers make sound in flight. But these guys kind of make a little, almost kind of soft, like you sometimes hear out in the meadows. It's kind of hard to track down, but these guys are definitely adding to the chorus out there. But yeah, this is a very common species, very, very, very widespread. And then we come to one of the most weird and wild species in Maine, in my opinion, Pseudopomala brachyptera, the bunch grass locust or the short-winged toothpick grasshopper. That this is honestly probably one of the coolest things. They're super duper long, they're super duper elongated, and they're very specialized to live in areas with native bunch grasses, mostly little blue stem. And to date, I've only found these in one place in Maine at the Kennebunk Plains, which some of you might know is a really, really rare habitat in Maine, filled with a whole bunch of other really endemic, or not endemic, really rare and threatened in Maine species, like the blazing star, the really rare flower that's there. There's a number of rare birds that breed there, and so this is one of these species of grasshoppers that's also there. That's very, very rare in the state. They're probably at a few other spots as well, but I think they really require really large, intact, open bunch grassy type habitats. And these pretty much always have these short wings. Male wings are a little bit longer than the female here. And yeah, the male has a really elongated subgenital plate here, which is kind of interesting. You might at first think that was an ovipositor, but actually that's a subgenital plate of the male. And the female, you can barely even see the ovipositor there. It just kind of comes to a blunt end. But yeah, this is another species that stridulates. You can see these big open veins or open spaces in the wing with the big veins between. It's kind of usually an indication that the species sings. And this is one of those species where they sit on the bunch grass and then they kind of sidle away from you like this when you're walking toward them, so you don't see them. And but you can usually cause them to jump away, and then they're actually really easy to catch. They don't really make much of an effort to escape. I think they're just I think they really look like pieces of grass, and they're like, I don't need to escape. I'm just a piece of grass. But yeah, this is a species that you're kind of unlikely to see unless you go to, well, either the Kennebunk Plains or some other places with bunch grasses. Really interesting species with these really big, wide antennae. Those are called ensiform antennae that are very, kind of flattened. So really neat animal. So now we'll move on to the bandwing grasshoppers, the Aegypodines, which, like I said before, the hind wing pattern is key. And here's this spans the gamut. These are all these photos of all of our main species of Aegypodines. And you can see it kind of spans from the hind wings from no color at all to kind of slight cloudiness, slightly clouded edges and a little bit of yellow tinge, to this, kind of more pale yellow and a more distinct black band, to more bright yellow and dark black bands, and then black with white on the outside, and then pink. And so in areas where there are more of these species, you can get all the colors of the rainbow. Like out in Arizona, there are ones with blue hind wings, red, orange, really gorgeous animals, but not quite as many of those here in Maine, because these, like I said, these tend to be species of kind of open, barren ground, and deserts in the Southwest are really good for them. So yeah, basically, when you see one of these things fly away with you with the big colorful wings, you kind of want to look at the hind wing pattern to see what you've got. So Arphia sulfurea, sulfur winged grasshopper. This is kind of one of those couple of species I mentioned earlier that breaks the mold in that they overwinter as nymphs. And the nymphs are these really like squat, pudgy, kind of toad-like things that hang out in the leaf litter. And then these adults are out by May. and they have really bright yellow wings, as you might expect from the name. And these make a lot of noise in flight. When you scare these up, they're really crackling and popping away from you. And that's called crepitation, which a number of the bandwing grasshoppers do. And that's kind of an interesting thing that still hasn't been fully worked out what the purpose of that is, because there's some hypotheses that say that crepitation is more to just frighten or startle a predator. And it is kind of startling when you're walking along a path and you see this thing pop up and it's making a whole bunch of loud crackling and popping noises. You're like, oh, and then it disappears. And that's what these grasshoppers might be hoping happens to a bird. And it also might be used in terms of a sexual display. And sometimes you'll see these species kind of hovering in place, making a whole bunch of noise for, several seconds at a time before kind of spiraling down to the ground. And then often, if you can watch this for long enough, you'll see when they spiral down to the ground, you'll see other individuals will kind of move toward them. So crepitation kind of functions, or is thought to function in a couple of different ways. And which is kind of an interesting thing, that one signal can be used for multiple things, multiple purposes. And then there haven't really been that many studies on what is actually going on, like how they are making that sound. I did see a recent paper from last year that documented crepitation in a species of one of these things from Asia, that where the wings are actually like clapping against each other, which was kind of contra the previous hypotheses that where there were in which the veins of the wings are like snapping and popping into place. So, and it may vary based on the species, but that's kind of an interesting thing that I wonder about sometimes. But anyway, these things make a lot of noise and they're flying around, and these are generally kind of brown, yellowish abdomen. And then the females can kind of be a little more variable, usually kind of brown like this, but once in a while you find a really dark black female like this. And usually you find these in areas where there's fire, areas such as the Kennebunk Plains, once again, where there's prescribed burns. And at the plains, there's prescribed burns to maintain the grassland and prevent trees from encroaching. And so sometimes you find individuals like this that are really like melanistic, all black, and that's kind of thought to be an adaptation where some individuals in the population are more are kind of black like this, and so that camouflages better in the kind of burned, charred landscape than the brown ones would be. It's kind of interesting. So yeah, this is an interesting species, comes out really early in the season, and basically feeding on grasses, usually kind of native grasses, and it tends to like places with a lot of sandy soil. So Kennebunk Plains is obviously a very sandy place, and then or it can be open rocks. Like here's these ones I found in Soldier's Delight in Maryland, which is a kind of an open, rocky barrens habitat. And so these guys, they need some sort of rocky, some sort of open ground, whether it's sand or rock, they don't really care. So yeah, and there's a fall counterpart to this, Arphia xanthoptera, the autumn yellow-winged or autumn sulfur-winged grasshopper, which has a much higher pronotum. The pronotum comes up like way higher like this, but that has not been documented in Maine before. And there are old records from Massachusetts. I've never seen it in the Northeast. I have looked long and hard for this thing in Maine and New Hampshire and Massachusetts, and I've not found it. So it could be in Maine, but I haven't seen it. Camnula pellucida is kind of an odd one out within the Oedipodines, in that it's the clear-winged grasshopper. It's a band-winged grasshopper with no band on the wing. And this is kind of a weird one. It acts more like a Melanopolis, which is a member of the Melanopline, than any of the bandwings. This is kind of a species that is in grass and not really on the open ground. And in the West, this thing is really common in the Western US, where they kind of swarm, and this is kind of an agriculturally important species out there. But in the Northeast, it really is not really very common at all. And for many years, I couldn't find any of these things in Maine or anywhere in the Northeast at all. And just not last year, 2020. In 2020, I finally found them for the first time. This female here, and then this wing picture are ones from Coos County, New Hampshire. And so, as it turns out, I think that these things are it's one of these species that have probably been affected by climate change, at least in the Northeast, or changing land use practices, where they seem to be still fairly common up in the northern reaches of New Hampshire and Maine as well. I found a few iNaturalist posts from Maine, but have kind of disappeared from the southern part of the state, and still pretty common on like roadsides and grasslands and stuff up there. But yeah, kind of an interesting, very pale yellow with these big black splotchy markings on the wings. Kind of an interesting animal that's not too common in our area these days. We kind of have to go north to find it. Cortophagia vertifasciata, the green striped grasshopper. I am betting that every one of you has seen this species. They are everywhere. And this is the second of those three species I mentioned that breaks the mold in that the nymphs overwinter. And the nymphs are incredibly tough. Here is a picture of a nymph that I had in New Hampshire that it was literally sitting on the snow in, I think, the middle of February. And there were multiple of them. It wasn't just one that was, stupid. There were multiple of them, and they are quite capable of sitting on the snow and jumping around and jumping around in very, very cold weather. And the nymphs are actually really cute. They have this, kind of stripe through the eye and these kind of short, stubby antennae. They kind of move very slowly like this. They're really adorable, but somehow they're the toughest of them all. And yeah, these overwinter in incredible densities, sometimes in open kind of grassy areas. And then the adults are out really early in spring, as early as mid-April. And then they kind of die off by July. And once again, this is another really variable species where they can kind of be brown, they can be gray, they can be green, and occasionally you have these really bright pink ones, which are honestly super gorgeous. And you'd think this would only be found in the South, but this one was from New York, and I've seen similar ones in New Hampshire, and I'm sure they occur in Maine as well. And so yeah, keep an eye out for these bright pink guys. And yeah, these are kind of more grading into slight band wing, but not really that much. They kind of have this pale yellow wing with kind of smudgy gray markings toward the tip and this kind of black along the edge there. And yeah, so I mean, these are really variable in color, but they kind of have a really distinctive overall shape. They kind of have this, fairly straight pronotum with just a little cut in the middle there, and then they usually kind of have this stripe through the eye. You can kind of see kind of a paler bit that goes through the eye. So yeah, a really interesting species that's very, very abundant and overwinters as nymphs, and these nymphs are just so strong. I don't understand it. Terra carolina is another species that I bet almost all of you have seen. The road duster, as it's called, the Carolina or black-winged grasshopper. This is the only grasshopper in our area that has these really dark black hind wings with the yellow exterior. It really looks like a morning cloak butterfly. And when you see it, and this is a really, really good flyer. So when you see it fly, it really looks like a morning cloak butterfly. And yeah, these things will fly quite long distances. So this is a really big species, really big and gray. Sometimes they're kind of more on the pale side, sometimes reddish, but generally gray like this. And they have this really high pronotal crest that has one really deep cut. And that's really distinctive. Almost none of our other species have this really like deep cut in the middle of the pronotal crest. So when you see that, you've got Terra, and you've got these big, striking black wings. So this is a species that's also kind of found in all sorts of open habitats, and it's a species that's probably benefited quite a lot from human activity, which you can't say for a lot of species, but because this thing really frequents roadsides, and it really likes like dusty, gross areas of roadsides, especially with a lot of like non-native plants and short grasses and forbs. And so this thing has the advent of like roads penetrating into dense forests and other habitats like that has probably allowed the species to extend its range into a lot of places it probably never occurred previously. And so yeah, in places like northern Maine, where it's kind of coniferous forest for miles and miles and miles, you'll pretty much only find this thing along the roadsides. But in southern Maine, where it's more developed, this thing will be flying around in all sorts of vacant lots. And I've even seen them on city streets in Portland. So really common and abundant, and really doing quite well with humans. In Coptolophus, the clouded grasshopper, and Coptolophus sordidus is something you probably won't see all that often. These three pictures are all of the same individual that I actually had at the Viles Arboretum at an MES field day last summer, I believe. And it was the only one we found that day. And I have honestly never seen more than 2 at a time in the field. This is really not very common at all. It is widespread in our area. It should be found across most of the state. And it doesn't really have that much of a specific habitat. The places I've found them have just been kind of open places with some grass. I've found them, in kind of junky roadside areas, and I've also found them in more pristine areas like the Kennebunk Plains. They're kind of, I don't really know why they're so limited, but they're never really that abundant and always among throngs of other species, other more common species. And they kind of have this same kind of wing as Cortophagia, where it's kind of very pale yellowish and then this kind of dusty, look toward the tip with a little black there. Nothing super duper strong in terms of band wings. And then this kind of subdued dark pattern. And then one of the obvious things to look for if you have a grasshopper that you think is this kind of row of little black dots you can see here along the back edge of the pronotum. That pretty much nothing else in our area has those, and these guys always seem to have that. It's kind of 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 little black dots kind of along the edge there. It's kind of interesting to see. Very subdued coloration, but kind of subtly interesting patterns. And this is a species that's of really late summer and fall. I have never found these any earlier than August, and I have found them into December. So very, very uncommon and really inconspicuous, but pretty tough. So I'm not really sure what the limiting factors are on these guys, but they're not really that abundant. Pardolephora piculata, the coral-winged grasshopper. Now here's something that some of you have probably heard me go on and on about a bit, but so I'll spend a little time on this guy. This is a species I still have yet to see myself, and this has kind of been a nemesis animal for me for quite a few years. So I'm kind of hoping to see it this year. This is a species that historically has been recorded all over the northern half of the U.S. and papers from 1920, the 1920s, like Morse. He says that it's recorded all the way from the top of Mount Katahdin to Nantucket Island, Massachusetts, which is like, well, okay, that's a huge range, and I've never seen it. And they have these really bright pink wings, and they overwinter as nymphs. And it supposedly is supposed to inhabit kind of open, brushy, sandy areas. And I have checked a lot of those places and never seen it. And the only recent record that I could find, and so these are photos that I took of specimens from the Cornell collection in Ithaca, New York. But the only recent record I could find for many years was this photo that past president of the MES, Charlene, sent me from North Traveler Mountain up in Baxter State Park, of one that they found while doing, I think, ant surveys up there. And this was the only record that I could find of it in any recent years. And I thought that this was a thing that may have been just driven north by climate change and only occurs in, really more alpine habitats, open, places further north. However, somebody on iNaturalist just posted maybe about a month or two ago, posted a photo from a sandplain area near Brunswick, which is way far south in the state compared to Baxter. So this thing still does occur in the state, but apparently very, very, very rarely. So if you see any grasshopper with pink wings is going to be this in the state. There's nothing else like it. So if you see this, let me know. I'm going to try to find it this year in May when I will return to Maine for a little bit. But it's a really neat species that it's kind of been a nemesis for me for a long time, and I'm coming closer to solving the mystery. And then I see I'm starting to probably run a little late on time here, so I might go over a bit. Sorry about that, but I'll skip through a few of these. So Cnidia, longhorn bandwing grasshopper, kind of interesting scattered species. They have these really long antennae. They're very sandy colored. They're always on open sand patches, and really kind of very bug-eyed. You can see the eyes kind of are stripy and they kind of stick out a lot. In our area, the wings are always yellow with a black band, but then in the southern populations, this species does go all the way down to Florida. They're orange. I'm not really sure why that is. All the ones I've collected from Texas to Florida to Massachusetts always have the orange wings, but in Maine and New Hampshire, they have yellow wings. But otherwise, in every other morphological detail, they agree. So kind of interesting. Our populations have yellow wings. I don't really know why. Sphaerogum unboli, Bull's grasshopper is one that's pretty uncommon in the state. I've only found one at the Kennebunk Plains, which seems to be a real magnet for interesting grasshopper species. This is a species of like woodland oak leaf litter that it looks like an oak leaf, and it flies kind of looking like a falling oak leaf, and then it falls into the oak leaf litter, and then you can't find it. So this thing is probably only in the southern part of the state, and it's kind of a woodland species as opposed to a lot of these other species that are in open areas. So kind of hard to find, but yeah, it's around. And then these are a pair of species in this genus Stephathyma that also kind of buck the mold of not being band-winged grasshoppers, having clear wings. And these are sedge grasshopper. These are restricted to sedge bogs, and so you really have to go like tromping through a sedge bog to find these things. But when you find them, they are really big and really gorgeous. And for a long time, I could not find these in the Northeast, and I finally did just find them a few years ago up in sedge bogs in Coos County, New Hampshire, once again, up kind of close to Mount Washington. And I'm sure they still occur in much of northern Maine as well. They're very habitat specific, and they're kind of hard to find in the sedge bogs, but when you do, they're really worth the trouble. And then there's this other species, Stephathyma lineatum, which is very, very similar, except they have this pale stripe along the wing, and the females are actually huge, and the males are really pretty looking, and basically the exact same habitat, exact same behavior and phenology. But yeah, really interesting and rare species that you really have to target to find. And then I believe this is the last, or no, second to last of the bandwing grasshoppers, Trimeretrobus maritima, the seaside grasshopper, which is a species of open beach dunes. And in Maine, there are not too many beach dunes. Most of them in southern Maine have kind of been destroyed by housing developments, but they definitely do still occur at Popham Beach State Park in Maine, as well as in coastal Massachusetts, especially on Plum Island. This is a species that just really looks like sand and really can fly all the way down the beach. Really gorgeous species. Trimeretrobus verculata, this is the final bandwing in our area. This is one that probably most of you are familiar with if you've gone up on mountains in the mid to late summer. This is the cracker locust, which these things, they crepitate. Boy, do they crepitate. These things sound like firecrackers blasting off across the landscape. And they're always flying around on open rocks up at the top of the mountain. Really dark, long-winged species crackling around on rocks at the top of the mountain. Really cool thing. But yeah, these are common in their appropriate habitat on top of mountains, but absent elsewhere. And here's an individual from Norwich Walk, which was in a sand pit of all places. Not really the place I expect to find it. And then we'll get to the melanoplans, which I'll try to get through a little quicker. The spur-throated grasshoppers. A lot of these species are really similar, and the thing to really look at is the shape of the male circus. And so the cerci are these, paired sensory organs on the butt of the males, and you can see here, these are all of our main species. You can see they kind of span the gamut from these kind of big boot-shaped ones to these ones with little bifurcated at the tip, to these ones that are thin, ones that are kind of wide and then taper and then wide again, all sorts of different shapes. So you kind of have to look at the butt end for these guys. Buniacris is kind of—
Hey, Brandon, yeah. 1 second real quick. Just going to butt in here because I think we will run over, and just remind folks that this will be recorded and posted online at a later point. So I know some folks might have to hop off. If you do, this will be on the website. And those folks that ask questions, if you have to hop off, I'll connect you with Brandon on the side, and we'll get your questions answered. But otherwise, we'll just let Brandon go and wrap it up. Thanks.
All right. Yeah. Sorry for running over. I'll try to get through some of this as quickly as I can. So the Buniacris is a cool species. This is these are mostly found at Jugtown Plains, which is another MES field day we did. Oh boy, quite a few years ago. This is a species that's completely wingless, not even wing buds at all, and they're kind of found up in northern regions, and they tend to be associated with rubus, blackberries. Very pretty green species. Melanopus bivitatis, the two-striped grasshopper, is another really common thing that probably all of you have seen. Big, it vomits a lot when you pick it up. Really nice yellow stripes on the top. Really big, chunky animal with these really big boot-shaped cerci. Feeds on pretty much like anything. You can feed it lettuce, and it'll be fine. Melanopus borealis is kind of an uncommon thing. It's very small, and it's kind of has this stout little circus, and kind of greenish to pinkish to brownish, but usually only found in like low kind of boggy areas, kind of a more northern quality, or like sometimes power line cuts through bogs or swamps, but usually never in that great of numbers, and usually kind of an early spring or early summer species, although they do overwinter as nymphs, so I don't really know how they mature so quickly. And then Melanopolis dawsoni, again, a lot of these species, I might be going through these a little quickly, but they're all very, very similar. Dawsoni is kind of a small species with short wings again, and this is a species of barrens habitats, and so this is kind of restricted in our area to the southern areas, Waterboro barrens, Kennebunk plains, things like that. This is really common out on the Great Plains of Central North America, but really uncommon in our area, very tiny and dark, and I overlooked them for many years, thinking that they were just like nymphs or whatever, and then I finally found them. Melanopolis differentialis is probably one of the most easily identified Melanopolis in our area. It's really big, bright greenish yellow with this really like obvious herringbone pattern on the hind leg, and big boot-shaped cerci. But this is only in the southern half of the state. I've only found them around like greenhouses, so I think they're probably being brought in from further south, but they are definitely established at one or two points in southern Maine. Melanopolis fasciatus, I mentioned earlier, this is a specialist on huckleberry and blueberry vaccinium. They kind of have this long circus and kind of these like dark bands on the hind femur. They kind of have this kind of intermediate wing length. They don't have super long wings, but it's not super short either. They kind of get to about halfway down the abdomen. Kind of an interesting species that you can find in numbers if you find a nice big blueberry barren, but otherwise you won't see them. And Femerobrum, red-legged grasshopper, here is another one that everybody has seen. Every field and vacant lot and roadside imaginable, and every color pattern imaginable, sometimes pink like this, sometimes green, sometimes brown, just everywhere. Super duper common, pretty much all I can say about it. Melanopolis keeleri is kind of rarish. This has really distinctive cerci that are forked at the tip, and these are kind of, again, sandy places, open grasslands, and the nymphs are actually really distinctive, and they have these two stripes through the eye. They're really cute, and they kind of lose that as they become older, but then they, the males get these bifurcated cerci, and these things live really late into the year as well, into October, November. Mancus is another short-winged thing that I don't have a whole lot to say about, other than it's kind of also tends to be associated with blueberries and huckleberries, but I haven't really strictly associated it to that yet. I found it in places where there weren't any, so I'm not super knowledgeable on these guys, but they're around, and they're usually in really small groups. Kind of midsummer. Punctulatus is kind of an interesting species, Melanopolis punctulatus, the pine tree grasshopper. This is our only truly arboreal species. This lives up in pine trees, and sometimes you find it on the side of the houses in pine needles or houses underneath pine trees. Nice gray, kind of reddish in the inside of the legs. But yeah, this species kind of is our only arboreal species. So, and mostly I find it on the side of the houses, not even out in the wild. Sanguinipes migratory grasshopper is very similar to red-legged, but it has a very different circus shape. It's very stout as opposed to kind of elongated more. And this is in the West, this is an important pest species actually in most of the Western US, but here it never really seems to reach pest proportions. And I always find it kind of restricted to like sandy places, which is kind of odd. I don't know why they have such a different behavior here than in the West. I wonder if it warrants it definitely warrants some study. And I think this is probably the last of the melanopolines, Paroxia, the olive green swamp grasshopper, which is a real oddity. That's these super duper long antennae, but not quite as long as the cricketer did, and really green and really quite beautiful. And this is just restricted to like swamps and marshes, that mostly only in the southern part of the state. I found it in a few spots in New Hampshire and once or twice in southern Maine. And then we get into the tetragids, which are just really the pygmy grasshoppers, which are really annoying to identify. These are family Tetragidae, and they have the pronotum that extends all the way over the body. You can see that. And these are, really kind of stout things that are found in kind of leaf litter or like low boggy areas. And there's a number of these species that can pretty much have, all of the species can have almost any color pattern. So you kind of have to look at these really fine details of morphology to identify them. So I'll kind of skip through these. We have Nomotetics, which is kind of tends to be an oak leaf litter. We have Paratetics, Cuculatus, the hooded pygmy grasshopper, which has a lot of different color variations that tends to be on like kind of cobblestone kind of areas along streams. We have these Tetrix arenosa, ornata, and subulata, which are all really, really stupidly similar, and all kind of found in a lot of wet, low, boggy areas, wet, muddy places where they feed on algae, supposedly. And yeah, this is just kind of illustrating some of the differences between parotitics and tetrix. You can see the distance between the eyes is much longer in tetrix as opposed to parotitics, but you know, kind of hard to tell in the field. And then Titigidia, the black-sided, which is probably the most easy to identify one, that it kind of is robust like this, and the males often have this kind of white stripe along the side. And here's a mating pair. You can see the females often don't have that stripe, but the males do. Same kind of habits. And then finally, this is the last species, the one species in Maine, the pygmy mole grasshoppers, which they have these little diggy front legs like this, fossorial forelegs. This is the group I work on, is probably closest to my heart. They're very they're convergently evolved with true mole crickets, which are quite an order of magnitude larger and are not really found in Maine as far as I know. And these are only in sandy areas, open kind of wet sandy areas near water, where they occur in really big densities. These are from Norwich Walk, Maine, which is a population where I first saw them, where Dana Mishu first brought me to see those, and kind of fell in love with them. And then, yeah, finally, the last thing I was going to say, oh yeah, and then these are kind of burrows. They make these little burrows in the mud, and you can kind of move away the mud, and you can kind of expose them in their burrows like that, and they're really cute. The last thing I was going to say is, how do we identify all these things? So I'm going to list some references at the end, but then the other thing is, using iNaturalist is actually really, and Bug Guide and things like that are actually really intuitive now. So if you just go to iNaturalist and you click on Explore, and you can kind of type in Orthoptera and then Maine, and then you can go to the species. And iNaturalist honestly has almost most of the species of grasshoppers and crickets and katydids in Maine. And I have personally looked at, I think, almost all of these 2,000 some observations. So most of them are basically all right. And you can kind of look at this and kind of scroll through and see which species have been posted around your area. And there's definitely a lot of room for improvement. So I think this is an interesting database to kind of keep adding to, because people are constantly posting photos, and it's really interesting to see what comes up, especially in the context of like the Parlophora that I mentioned, where I have been trying for years to find it, and then some random person has just found it. So kind of interesting to see. So yeah, that's and here's some references of some good papers and books and websites to look at if you want to get more into this. And I'd be happy to take questions. I'm sorry I ran way over.
No problem, Brandon. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. And I think we're probably going to have you back for a winter workshop one of these years, where we can give you half a day to talk about this stuff, because I think you can certainly do it, and that would be great. So yeah, I hope folks can hang out for a few minutes. I understand folks got to go. We do have some questions, so I'm going to stick around and work through them with Brandon. Hopefully you have a few extra minutes too.
Yeah.
So stay tuned if you can. Otherwise, like I said, we'll get all this stuff posted on the web as soon as we have the space. So let's launch into it. First question from Kathy. The morphology of grasshoppers compared to both crickets and katydids is pretty different. Do the DNA profiles confirm that taxonomy and the closeness of relatedness?
Yeah, so there have been recently there have been some pretty large like phylogenomic studies on reconstructing the phylogeny of a lot of these things, and some of them have fallen out in weird places for sure, like the gomphosphorines and odipodines, the bandwings and the slant-faced grasshoppers were kind of historically kind of thought to be pretty separate, but we're now kind of finding that those, along with another subfamily Acridinae that we don't have in our area, they've all kind of arisen from the same thing. So some of these subfamilies may be more closely related than we thought in the past, but overall, a lot of the morphological assertions from the past have kind of continue to hold up, even with the phylogenomic data.
All right. Next question from Gail. Do female grasshoppers dig their egg holes with their legs or what?
So as far as I know, they dig it with the ovipositor valves. So they have those kind of 4 little curved tips of the valves, and they kind of just, so they need soft soil to be able to do this, but they kind of do this and go and kind of continually open them and kind of press it down into the soil like this, kind of digging it with their ovipositor valves, and then they lay an egg pod down there. And so obviously that kind of requires soft soil to do so.
Mhm. Interesting. Okay, next question from Philip. Are there any grasshopper species of potential conservation concern in Maine? For example, regional endemics, narrow habitat specialists, or just plain rare that biologists should consider for state special concern status? Currently, there are no orthopterans listed on any of those state lists. So you touched on some of that, but go back and revisit that for us, would you?
Yeah, I mean, so there's definitely a few species that are pretty uncommon in the state, and but I think most of them are, it's just because they're tied to specific habitats. Like some of them that I said like are tied to sedge bogs. Some of them are tied to sand dunes, and some of them are tied to open rocks. And especially the ones like Trimeratropus and Cynidia that are restricted to sand dunes. Those are probably some of the ones that I'd say are probably most imperiled, because sand dunes and are pretty rare in the state, and a lot of them have been like destroyed down in the south there, and the ones that are associated with like native grasslands as well, because native grasslands are kind of hard to come by, and most of them are either kind of destroyed or they're being overgrown with trees. And so like, you know, at the Kennebunk Plains and I think the Waterboro Barrens, some of those are maintained by controlled burns, and I think a lot of places could probably use some more controlled burns, because otherwise trees overgrow them and then these grasshoppers can't live, and a lot of other like endemic plants and things also can't live.
Great. Yeah, and yeah, if you have further thoughts on that, you and Philip might want to connect, because as an IF&W employee, he might actually have some influence on that process if there's a need. Maybe it's just one of these things that's not well studied enough to really be an informed thing. Yeah, next question from Eric, and on probably a lot of our minds, we want to know a little bit about your photographic process. Your photos are beautiful. So Eric says, I like your photos. Did you cool the hoppers and then take a photo of them in the light box? Or my preferred version is that you ask them nicely to hold still. So which is it?
I used to try to put them in the freezer for a few seconds or minutes and try to get them to stay still, but then I found that often left them in like kind of unnatural looking poses. They kind of be like sitting there like half dead looking, or they'd be covered in condensation, and I just didn't like the way that looked. So these days it's pretty much all the latter. I just kind of try to get them to stay still, and sometimes it takes a lot of corralling them around, or you know, they jump away, I have to chase them across the room, bring them back, and then so I just kind of, and yeah, I definitely use a light box. I've actually got it here. It's just one of these things that you can buy, kind of like a hamper almost. And yeah, I just I have an off-camera flash that I put in there to get the diffused light to bounce off the inside of that to kind of come down on the grasshopper. And then I have my camera with a macro lens, and I just kind of have a little remote trigger on the camera and the flash, so the flash fires when I press the shutter button. And yeah, then it's just a matter of, I get the grasshopper on a piece of white printer paper kind of on front of this light box here, and then I just kind of get the grasshopper to try to stand there. And sometimes they're really cooperative and sometimes they're not, but yeah, that's pretty much how I do it. It's
is that just really good macro photography, or is that photo stacking as well?
No, I do not do any focus stacking, and I just
oh wow, then hats off, even more so. Very good.
Kind of difficult to focus stack, honestly, because they're with around so much.
Right. So okay, back to another question from Philip. Do you think grasshoppers or Orthoptera generally as a group are well suited to statewide citizen science for an atlasing effort, as has been done in Maine for other orders like Odonata, Lepidoptera, and Bombus species?
Honestly, I would say yes. I mean, maybe I'm a little biased because I like them, but I think yes, because there aren't that many species. You know, it's probably, the diversity is probably comparable to things like butterflies that have been done. And, you know, these are pretty big insects. These are pretty noticeable. And, you know, with good photos, they can be identified without even having to collect most of them. And yeah, it's just it would kind of be a matter of like seasonality, because some of these species because probably the best time to do it would be from July to September, July, August, September, because then you get like some of the spring species that are dropping off, and then you get all the summer species. So it's kind of a shortish window to document them. But yeah, I think they could be a good candidate for atlasing and kind of citizen science, finding them around and documenting their distributions around the state in abundance, because they're pretty big and they're easy to collect. Kids can catch them really easily.
They are fun to chase. Everybody knows that. So yeah, certainly charismatic. Agreed. Okay. Next question. Yeah, you did touch on this, but just to re-ask it, Kathy asked if there's any exotic non-native grasshoppers, I guess in Maine, and you mentioned that one species poses some issues outside of Maine. So any other comments on that?
Yeah, so in grasshoppers, I mean, yeah, there's a few species that are more common in the West and they're kind of agricultural pests. But yeah, no grasshoppers are really currently pests in Maine. There are some historical reports of like Camnula or Melanopus sanguinipes causing some damage to crops in Maine, but I really don't see anything like that anymore. I think they just don't occur in those kind of densities anymore. There are no non-native grasshoppers in Maine as far as I know. There's an introduced European Corthippus that's in New Brunswick, and it's getting pretty close to Maine. So I feel like that's gonna show up in what is that furthest east county of Maine, Washington County.
Washington, yep.
I think they're probably going to show up there sooner or later because they were introduced in New Brunswick and they're kind of spreading westward. So that's one to look for. But so far that hasn't really been having any obvious negative effects. It's just a generalist grass feeder and it's mostly feeding on like European grasses. So nobody really seems to care much about it. And then there are a couple of introduced crickets and katydids, but I didn't cover those.
All right, well, I'm going to jump ahead to the second question that relates directly to that, and then I'll get back to Pete's question. So is the Asian introduced camel cricket in Maine?
The Distromina cinnamora, probably. I've never seen it in Maine, but it's definitely in Massachusetts, and it probably is in Maine somewhere. I would say it probably cannot survive our winters yet, but it probably occurs in areas that are like closer to cities or towns or in greenhouses, conservatories, things like that. It definitely could occur in Maine, and it likely does. It's definitely in Massachusetts, and it's very common further south.
Probably a matter of time. And then back to Pete's question. For ID purposes, is the backside the most important thing to get a picture of?
Yeah, definitely, especially if you have a male. Yeah, get a picture that clearly shows his butt. And it's unfortunate, but yeah, the butt end is really important. And then with the band-winged grasshoppers, that hind wing pattern is important. But yeah, generally with grasshoppers, I mean, if you give me like a nice straight-on lateral view, and then with the Melanopus, if you can see the end of the abdomen, I can tell you what it is, and you can figure it out from looking at references and stuff.
Great. So that's the end of the questions in the chat box. Last thing I will do here is, Pete gets another one in. Were you pulling the wings out while they were alive in those photos?
Oh yeah, so that's a thing that you can do. So yeah, all those photos with the wings, they were alive in those shots, except for the one where it was a pin specimen. But yeah, you can hold them and then kind of pull out the wing with a pair of forceps and then take a picture that way, and then the wings will just snap back into place and they'll be fine. So I mean, you kind of have to be a little,
gotta have the magic touch, yeah, which I'm sure you do.
Careful, but it's definitely doable without like killing them.
So yeah, that's the end of the questions in the chat box. So last thing I will do is ask anybody that's still on, if you have a question you'd like to ask Brandon directly, go right ahead. You can unmute or raise your hand and I'll call on you. So I'll give that a minute to see if we have any takers.
This is Harry Zerl, and I have a quick question.
Hi.
Are there any endemics up on the top of, in like the table end of Mount Katahdin that are only found, not endemics, but boreal or Arctic alpine type species that are only found on the table length of Mount Katahdin, like there are a couple of butterflies and moths up there that are only up there?
Right. Yeah. Was that the Mount Katahdin butterfly, whatever, like an Arctic or something? Yeah. Not that I know of. There probably are. There's definitely some species like Trimeratropus berculata and Huniacris that are probably way more common up in those regions than anywhere else in the state. and there might be one or two Melanopolis, like Melanopolis bruneri is one I didn't cover, but there's one picture on Bug Guide of one from, I think, up in Mount Katahdin that really, really looks like bruneri. That's like a far northern species, and so there might be some kind of, maybe not endemic, but like far more boreal type species that are probably up there, but I don't think anyone has really looked very carefully. I would like to.
All right, great. That's a good question. Any other questions out there in the audience? I don't see any hands raised. So yeah, that being said, yeah, Brandon, hopefully you can see the chat box. A ton of praise coming in for you. And,
thanks, everyone.
I will echo that. Thank you so much for a great presentation. Richard, I see you unmuted. Did you have a question?
Yeah, if you were a bird, which one of these grasshoppers would be the tastiest?
Well, I don't know if I can really answer that because I'm not a bird, but I feel like probably the biggest, chunkiest ones like Melanopolis differentialis or bivitatis are probably just have the most like meat on them, like in terms of like muscle mass, and
Right.
is the best. None of our species, as far as I know, are toxic. There's definitely some species in the Southwest and in the tropical regions that are really colorful and feed on like poisonous plants. So you know, definitely birds are not wanting to eat those, but I believe all of our species are edible.
Okay, thank you.
Trial and error. That's the only way to figure that one out.
Yeah. Try it out, I guess. Yeah.
But all right, great. Well, I'm gonna call that a wrap. Thanks again, everybody, for tuning in. Thanks, Brandon. Yeah, quick plug for next month's. We'll be back, I think, in exactly 1 month on March 10th, as the Thursday falls. So Dave Quartermanch will be presenting. I saw Dave on the webinar tonight earlier, but I think he might be gone. But anyways, we'll be talking about the Maine Aquatic Biodiversity Project that happened back in 2000, and Dave will obviously be focusing on some of the aquatic entomology highlights from that project. So we look forward to that too. So with that, yeah, I bid everybody a good night, and yeah, hopefully we'll see you next month. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
So
Thanks for
long.
having me.